Well, hello again, everyone, and welcome to Concert Conversations with the Quad City Symphony Orchestra. I'm Kai Swanson, very, very grateful to be with you today, especially considering the folks with whom we get to have a conversation today. And with that, I want to introduce the music director of the Quad City Symphony Orchestra, Mark Russell Smith, our Maestro Smith, and also our special guest today, the soloist for the April Masterworks concerts, Roberto Díaz, joining us from the Curtis Institute in Philadelphia. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us today.
It's a pleasure.
Great to be here.
Well, it's a treat to have you back, Mr. Díaz. It's always great when we get to show off our symphony to great musicians from around the world, but it's even better when they want to come back. we're grateful to have you with us. And it's a wonderful program that we're going to be talking about, but I want to zero right in on this extraordinary opportunity because you're joining us for Jennifer Higdon's Viola Concerto. Now, our audiences are familiar with Higdon, thanks largely to Maestro Smith for bringing the works of Jennifer Higdon and other great contemporary composers to our ears. But this is, I think, extra special because this piece was written with you in mind. And I think about Brahms and how he would write for people whom he adored. Well, first off, I can only imagine what it must have been like for you when you discovered that Higdon was writing a piece for you. How was that?
Well, I think that, I mean, there's so many things to talk about in a situation like that. I think the fact that it is part of our responsibility as performers, I think, to, grow the repertoire. I think especially for the viola where, we have a wonderful repertoire of pieces for viola and orchestra, especially as we get closer to our contemporary composers. But I think also the opportunity for me to work with somebody like Jennifer, who is on the forefront of, American composers. I understand that at one point, if not still, she's, I think, the most performed living American composer, so, to have the opportunity to work with her and to commission this piece from her. And it was a great opportunity to put together, several factors that sort of aligned to have the creation of the piece. Not only was it a commission by an individual, but it was also a result of an anniversary of a very special instrument. And it is a Stradivarius viola, which is it's on long-term loan to the Library of Congress. It is the Tuscan Medici viola of Stradivarius, 1690 is the year. And it is an instrument that I have had the opportunity to play. The family that owns it is very encouraging for me to use the viola. And so it was a way to celebrate the instrument and Jennifer and a viola concerto. And it was a co-commission with the Library of Congress, which is an incredible institution. So there were just so many different layers and factors that came into being to have this piece done. And it's been, really successful on so many different levels.
Well, first, thanks. I have to confess, I didn't know the story about the commission, which in many ways makes it more exciting. I often think that a commission of serious music is a real investment in the future. That right, that you're not just putting out a legacy, but you're investing in the sensibilities and tastes of a generation we may not meet. And so I'm always in awe. And I'm grateful that the Quad City Symphony Orchestra has been able to be part of commissions in the past too. That's fantastic. But let's pause there for a moment and talk about the viola. As you mentioned, not the richest, broadest repertoire. And I just think that's wrong. I don't have the words to put around this, but when I listen to a viola, I think I hear a voice that's more human than a violin. But how should I more technically describe that? Why is it that I sense that with a viola more than I do with a violin?
Well, I think it's the register of the instrument. You know, the natural register of the instrument is really kind of within the register of the voice. You know, so it comes in sort of at an alto tenor sort of place, and in fact, the viola in certain parts of the world is known as an alto. And so I think that, you know, it's a timbre, if you will, that we kind of relate on a very sort of natural kind of human way. And I think that, you know, as we saw the evolution of the instrument itself, you know, the viola really has, and not unlike the violin or the cello or the bass, certainly, you know, the instruments have kind of evolved physically to adapt to the demands that composers have actually made on the instruments technically. And you know, you can see that certainly when, you know, when Bach wrote the 6 sonatas and partitas, you know, it required the violinist to do things on an instrument that was known as a sort of a single line instrument. All of a sudden you have the Bach chaconne and you have to sound like 4 violinists playing together on one instrument. And then you go further, you have Paganini, you know, evolving the technique of the instrument and the possibilities, and, you know, intervals that were unheard of as far as, you know, how wide you have to stretch your hands and things like that. And what has happened in the viola is not really dissimilar to some of those, you know, those needs and that evolution, if you will. And so we see that, for example, going back to this Stradivarius viola, you know, what's interesting about it is that it was a commission made by the Medici family of Stradivarius, but it was actually a commission for a string quintet. And you'd think, okay, well, where's the 5th instrument? And the 5th instrument is actually another viola. One was a tenor and one was an alto. So even back then, there were very clearly 2 different types of violas. So the commission is 2 violins, a tenor, an alto viola, and a cello. And this is the alto, the smaller of the 2 violas. And you know, luckily, for the sake of preserving history, that viola is of a size that makes it possible, although I have to say barely, because Jennifer really exploited the high register of the viola. And that viola, while it is within normal specifications size-wise, you know, for what we need today, it is on the edge a little bit. So certainly, you know, physically for the player, for your hands, it's, you know, it's on the edge, but it's
on the edge. Large size. It's large, right? It's bigger.
Yeah, it's on the large side of still being manageable. You know? Right. And so, but it works, and you know, it's been an amazing possibility to perform on the viola and to highlight the instrument. I mean, you know, it's funny, at Curtis, I said to my students, when I had the viola in Philadelphia for a while, I said to my students, knowing the answer, of course, how many of you have seen a real Stradivarius viola? And the answer is no one has. I mean, he only made 12 of these instruments, and I think 10 of them are either in museums or owned by foundations or banks or corporations, and they're basically out of circulation. And this one happens to be one of the 2 that are privately owned, and I'm very fortunate that the family, you know, has the interest and made it available for me to do this project on it. And it has highlighted the fact that, you know, an instrument like that needs to be heard, needs to be seen, needs to be experienced. And it's been really kind of a fascinating piece in that way, because it has brought to the forefront an instrument, not just a piece, you know, but a specific instrument that hasn't had a lot of sort of public exposure. So it's very interesting.
Oh, I'm so intrigued at so many levels. I do want to get Maestro Mark Russell Smith involved in the conversation, but I got to begin by noting, I mean, my goodness, you're on the faculty at Curtis. Jennifer Higdon has a long association with Curtis. Samuel Barber, who's also appearing on this program, had a long association with Curtis. Now, you wouldn't happen to know anything about Curtis, would you, Mark Russell Smith?
Yeah, I mean, we know that it's a running joke. It's a running joke with the Quad City audience. Is this like, okay, yet another soloist from Curtis, or yet another some deal with Curtis? Like, oh, Curtis, Curtis, Curtis. That's all they hear about. But
no, we just want to know when you're going to open up a campus here in the Quad Cities.
That'd be great. I would love that. That'd be great.
That's good.
You know, obviously, the Curtis connections and the legacy and everything that Curtis gave me as a young musician, I'm incredibly grateful. And I go back and conduct as often as I can the orchestra, and I do operas, and I really try to maintain, even as an old conductor now, you know, try to maintain as much connection as I can. And, you know, the soloists whom I invite and people who we commission, and I mean, it's obviously, these are people like Jennifer Higdon and I were classmates. You know, we began at Curtis of the same year, and so it's just a natural that I would have interest in her and her music, and you know, anyway, so it's hard to avoid, but I think everybody's pretty good with that, you know, in the Quad Cities.
Well, let's just set the record straight. We are all very grateful for the connection because it introduces us to Jennifer Higdon, to Roberto Díaz, and so many other great things. However, for a moment though, because of those connections, we get this work on the program, the Higdon Viola Concerto. But I'm always intrigued, Maestro, by your thought process in putting together the rest of the program around that, because a great deal of care is devoted to that.
Right. And this one's tricky because this was a program that was supposed to happen. I mean, it was originally programmed for, I think, April of 20, right? But no, I think that's right. No, April, of 20. So, you know, and everything shut down basically February or early, well, we had Verdi Requiem March of 20. And so, so we were going to end the season just like we are. We were going to end that season with Roberto and the Higdon and Pint of Rome. I think it's same, right? Yeah. So other things kind of changed a little bit, and you know, we tweaked things and stuff. And so the idea of adding Samuel Barber to the mix, you know, again, it's not just because he's a Curtis composer, but you know, we're having a real focus on contemporary American concerti. And so we opened the season with the Barber Piano Concerto, which is amazing. And the Barber Symphony is a piece that I love, that I've done a lot. And it's really one of the great American kind of that time, a great American symphony that's underrepresented, I think. Actually, now that I'm studying, and I, you know, of course I got the Viola Concerto score out, and it's like, oh my God, this is a hard program. I mean, with the Higdon Concerto and then the Barber Symphony is only 20 minutes, but it's like hard as heck. Pines of Rome, the orchestra knows really well, and anyway, so I mean, it's nevertheless, it's a super challenging program, but you know, having those two American pieces, and certainly Higdon and Barber speak the same language in a different generation. You know, they come from the same place as far as lyricism, as far as singing quality. Boy, the Barber, yeah, I mean, the Barber Symphony, the Barber Piano Concerto, like I talked about with which we opened the season. I mean, he's such a just lyrical composer, and so color, you know, so color oriented, you know, and so to pair that with Higdon seemed like a really natural thing to me.
Well, and yes, please go ahead.
It's very interesting, actually, because I think that when you start to, and there's a conversation that I've had with Jennifer, you know, many times, you know, you can see how in this piece she firmly stands on the shoulders of those that came before her. You know, you hear Barber, you hear Bernstein, you hear Copland. You know, it's not in any way, you know, that she's taking music from, but it's just, there's something about this sort of sonic, or the orchestration, the way she orchestrates the piece. You know, it's really, for example, the opening of the last movement is basically just a dialogue between the viola and the brass section.
Right.
You know,
right.
it's really very interesting because coloristically, it really has a very new yet familiar sound to it.
Right.
You know, and it's very much her own language, but it's you can relate to it. Like, yeah, this is comfortable to me.
Right. And that's the
comforting.
thing about her. I mean, she is her own voice. I mean, her music.
Oh yeah.
It sounds like her, but exactly like Roberto said. I mean, it comes right out of that tradition of the way the use of the orchestra, the lyricism. I mean, one thing just from a technical standpoint that is, and I've done a lot of her pieces, including a tuba concerto, actually with the Curtis Orchestra, is kind of the way that they're like, for the conductor, there's like big beats and there's like a lot of activity in between those beats. I mean, there's a lot going on. So it's like she's kind of figuring out like how to harness this lyrical idea, like how's the best way to notate it. And it's like, yikes. I mean, it's tricky for everybody. I mean, Roberto, your lyrical lines, I mean, everything's written out very clearly, but it's extremely rhapsodic in nature and like very improvisatory, but like just fitting, especially the first movement, like just fitting it all together is just like, oh, you know, I'm sweating already just like thinking about it, you know. But that's I mean, she's very consistent in that. Many of her pieces are exactly that, you know, and so it's beautiful and very effective, and audiences love it, you know.
Now, as we're talking about Jennifer Higdon, I find it fascinating that she came to music not super early. I mean, she started an instrument at the age of 15 and wasn't really thinking about all these kinds of things. I think about some of the other composers even on this program. I mean, Barber was very steeped in music as a child, thanks to his family being that way. But I will say, Mr. Diaz, I'm always intrigued by how great musicians enter their relationship with music, and that story of how it becomes more than just something you're doing, but something you want to make a way of living through. And would you mind sharing with us a little bit about your youth and your journey with music?
Sure. Well, you know, my parents were both professional musicians. My mother was a pianist. My father is a violist. And so all of us at home grew up listening to music all the time, you know, and my parents were both very active, and you know, they played a lot of recitals together. And you know, after my father studied at Indiana University with William Primrose, who I understand was a very familiar person at Quad Cities.
Yes, absolutely.
So I would probably guess that Quad Cities has had more viola concertos in its history than just about any orchestra anywhere.
We should look that up, because there's a whole history, and like the roster of soloists is just like mind blowing. It really is. Yeah.
I bet you Primrose played there all the time.
I think you're right. Right. We'll look it up.
So you know, we grew up listening to music, and as a result of that, 3 out of the 4 of us ended up being, you know, professional musicians. We were never really pushed to becoming professional musicians, but there was no choice as far as studying music. So, you know, that was something that my parents felt was extremely important, you know, and a study in some instrument or voice or what have you was something that we all had to do. I started as a violinist, and then, you know, when we moved to the States, I was physically big enough to play a real viola as opposed to just a violin with viola strings on it. And so I switched from the violin to viola. It was probably an act of desperation on my father's side. You know, because playing soccer was really where my heart was at that time, coming from Chile. But so I switched to viola, and then it just kind of took off from there. And you know, I went to music school after high school. I did a little stint in industrial design, and which came in very helpful at one point in my Curtis career with the new building that we built 10 years or so ago. But then I just kept going with music, and after New England Conservatory, I came to Curtis, and I studied there for a couple of years. So it's been, music goes all the way back to the first things we heard at home were music.
That's fascinating. Well, I'm so captivated by the fact that this work was really written with you in mind. And Maestro, we've talked before about how it is when you're working with soloists, the symphony prepares, and then the soloist comes in and you get a couple of exposures to kind of hammer things out there. But I would have to say that your word probably doesn't matter that much in terms of interpretation, because Mr. Díaz says, well, no, she actually told me it's supposed to sound like this. So how?
Right. I mean, it's a mixed blessing, because, we can't go back and ask Brahms or Bartok what he thought, but we can ask Jennifer Higgins. So that's good. That's good. But I mean, you also, the musicians I invite to the Quad City Symphony are like simpatico with our, we make music the same way. We study in the same way. And so, it comes very naturally. It comes very naturally. And we understand each other musically. And that's because of who we are as musicians, but also the training we have, the shared training, and just a certain approach. And those are the people that I like working with, and that I think like working with me. And so it always works out well.
And it's interesting because I've had in many ways this experience with Jennifer and Roberto Sierra, who has written a couple of pieces for me, and others where I have performed their piece more than once. Penderecki also. Mark, you and I have done the Penderecki concerto.
Right.
And that was a piece that, the viola concerto is a piece that I played with Penderecki actually conducting many times. And it was very interesting how he would ask for things that were completely different, not only of the orchestra, but also of me. Even like 2 weeks later, playing it in a different place, he would say, no, don't do it that way, but do this instead, and it's interesting because it goes to show that while I may have talked to Jennifer about approaching something, a certain way in the concerto, if we're working together on the piece somewhere else, she may request something different. It could be because of acoustics. It could be, for example, one of the things that kind of evolved in time was the final tempo of the second movement. And as Mark alluded to in the first movement, the second movement is actually incredibly difficult and challenging for the orchestra and the soloist to stay together, because it's incredibly busy, and sometimes there is actually no beat. And yet it has to stay very sort of machine-like together. And so in certain acoustics, you have to make the adjustments so that it can be heard the way it was imagined and composed. And in some places, you can move the tempo around. So you have to really be flexible in many ways. And in some halls, the balance with the orchestra will be very different. Right. And so what she wrote as a mezzo forte all of a sudden doesn't matter. Right. And she will, I almost every time I've played the piece and she's been at a dress rehearsal or something, she makes adjustments, and a lot of it is just how to, sort of prioritize, if you will, the lines and balance, and sometimes sort of thin out the textures that need to be done just because of the needs of the moment. But so it's really interesting in that way, because I've seen it certainly with Penderecki many times, and with Jennifer, that they will make requests depending on the needs of the moment, and that's kind of fascinating.
Right.
You know,
and Kai, right. And living, you know, this is the thing, Kai, about working with living composers is, I mean, there's, no matter how sophisticated notation is or how detailed, you can never notate everything. And so there are composers who are like control freaks who say, do it exactly like I said, but those are rare, actually. I mean, usually composers are like, wow, I never thought of it that way. Or yeah, we need to move, you know, I mean, that they allow the performers some leeway to bring it to life, and that they like and they embrace and they say, yeah, well, wow, that's fantastic. I didn't think of that. Or, you know, now that I hear it, we need to, you know, I mean, just exactly like Roberto said. So it's a living, breathing thing. You know, the difference is now we have the composer out in the hall to talk to, and, you know, and these are the same decisions we make with Beethoven and with Bach and with Bartok, but, you know, we do it kind of with a little more freedom, I guess, or, you know, a little less anxiety because they can't talk back, you know. But so it's a mixed blessing to have the composer, but in my experience, the living composer is exactly like Roberto said. I mean, wants that flexibility and contributes to that. And so it just underscores how important it is, our role is to bring, it's not just about knowing exactly what's on the page, but how we bring that to life, and the things and the adjustments we have to make.
Well, I was afraid this was going to happen. I'm having so much fun listening to the two of you talk. We're giving short shrift to the rest of the program, but we do want to mention that the program opens with Johann Strauss' Frühlingsstimmen. And I'll only say that I had the opportunity to hear Kathleen Battle sing the vocal version of that. And your life is never the same after you've heard Kathleen Battle sing Voices of Spring. And then, of course, I'm joining you today from a pine grove in Rome, just so we don't forget about Ottorino Respighi's Pines of Rome. But I do definitely want to talk with both of you about Samuel Barber's Symphony No. 1. First, Maestro, if you could tell us what we should be listening for this weekend. And then also, Roberto, if you would care to weigh in too, because Barber is so connected with Curtis. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it too. But Maestro.
Well, you know, Barber, like Jennifer Higdon, it was like unashamedly his own guy. It's like, here's how, no matter what is going on in the rest of the world, and no matter what, you know, other schools of composition are, or what the critics are saying, like, this is who I am, and this is my music. And with this symphony, I mean, the fact that it's a symphony says a lot. I mean, it's already kind of a, you know, an old form. And so everything's compact. So it's through compose, there's no stopping, but there are 4 movements. You know, there's a passacaglia, which is an old form, you know, an old Baroque form. I mean, so and there's a scherzo. They're all the trappings of the quote unquote conventional symphony, but in his unique language. I mean, in the way he orchestrates, the incredible rhythmic drive. I mean, very complicated, very tricky rhythms in the scherzo. I mean, it's you know, for kind of a demure guy that we think of him, I mean, it's just like rhythmically he lays it out there, just like in the piano concerto. I mean, there's some, like, you know, really, really cool, sophisticated rhythms, and then the lyricism. You know, it's just a very listenable piece. You can follow the trajectory really well. I mean, he's a guy who's formally so skilled, you know, very skilled composer, that he takes us on this journey, and you feel, you know, there's a great inevitability to it. And I think just super, anyway, it's just a very interesting mini symphony that really captures who Barber is.
You know, we used to take that piece on tour a lot.
Right.
With the Philadelphia Orchestra. Savalas was very fond of this piece. And I remember often thinking about it, that there's not a single extra note in this piece. He says exactly everything he needs to say, and there's not 1 minute extra of music. You know, it's so well crafted and concentrated, and there's not a moment where you feel like, well, I think we've heard this before. You know, it's kind of, you know, which you do get a lot of times. And you know, I mean this sort of sometimes in symphonic music, you get a little bit sort of short on ideas and long on time, and then you start to hear things just kind of, but in this piece, it's just like he's sort of, boiled it down to the essential length.
Right. And he's like Brahms in that way. I mean, as far as typically everything's connected. I mean, actually, this piece pairs really well with Brahms. I've done this with Brahms 1 and Brahms 4. I mean, it pairs really well. But I mean, exactly. It's succinct and again, not a wasted note, which is very Brahms-like. I mean, so Barber, harkens back to the old school, but still, it's his voice. There's no doubt about it. And so, I mean, and it was very, at that time, very it was untrendy at that time, and he didn't care. And people were playing his music. I mean, George Zell, I mean, Leinstorff, all those mid-century orchestras. I mean, he was being played a lot.
But if you think in comparison to these enormous symphonic pieces that were being written, mega symphonies, it's really, it's like the chocolate cake that's only this tall.
Exactly. Very flavorful, right?
Well, I'm ready for this. Is so. I just, on behalf of everyone actually right now who's watching this at home, I want to thank both of you because you have made us so anxious to hear this incredible program of music. And so on behalf of all those people, I wish we could continue for a while, but I think pretty soon you're going to have to hop a flight here, Roberto. But anyway, for now, though, I want to thank you both so very, very much. Our soloist, Roberto Díaz, the music director of the Quad City Symphony Orchestra, Mark Russell Smith. Yes, please, Maestro.
Well, don't forget about Pines of Rome, too, which is one of the great orchestral showpieces.
Well, I mean, I think
EPW, right. I mean,
but you're absolutely right because
the season's going to end with a bang.
It's an incredible
no better season ender than that. And
I wish we could talk more about Respighi because he was such an interesting guy. But for now, I do want to also say thanks to Chris Connolly and Wells Fargo Advisors for generous support of Concert Conversations and all the education and outreach programs of our beloved Quad City Symphony Orchestra. And friends, I hope to see you at the concert. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kai.
Thank you.